dive into the lesson, I was hoping I could get a couple reading volunteers this morning. We're going to be in Acts 24 this morning. And I'm trying to pull up the first one. First one, can I get someone to read verses 2 through 9? All right, Carol? That'd be one of them. Then, can I get someone to read verses 22 to 27? Nana, thank you. And finally, Acts chapter 9, verses 15 to 16. Small. All right, 15
to 16?
Yeah, chapter 9, verses 15 to 16. That one's a little bit of a flashback. So where are we with the study? Well, last week we got to see Paul. He had that meeting before the Sanhedrin. Let me get to. All right. So he had the meeting before Sanhedrin, and then they, because of some of the uprising that happens, the Romans decided to take him up to Felix. Now, one of the funny parts of chapter 23 is these 40 Jewish men, they decide that they want to kill Paul, and they take an oath that they are not going to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. And the problem for that is someone catches wind of the plot, tells the Romans, and because with Roman centurions and the way that their prison system worked, if you lost your prisoner, you were the one who would die in the place of that prisoner. That was their incentive to make sure soldiers didn't just let anybody go. Because of that, they end up putting like 200 infantry and 70 horsemen surrounding Paul as they travel up to Ceasarea, which is a little hard for 40 men who haven't gotten to eat or drink in the last couple days to defeat. So one is simply left to wonder if they broke their vow or if they starved to death. We aren't told that.
Well, they died of dehydration first.
Die of dehydration because they said they wouldn't drink. Regardless, we're not told what exactly happens to them. But then at the end, we are given this letter that the who was it? I think it was the centurion. He writes this letter up to Felix that he sends with Paul when he's going up, and this is kind of here is my position on what's happened, and he even says, I can't find anything deserving of either imprisonment or death in Paul, but given his accusers and given that he's a Roman citizen, I decided to send him up to you, because Felix is the Roman governor in the area. He is Rome's authority within the region. And so Felix decides that he will hear the case when Paul's accusers arrive, and they arrive about 5 days later. We see in verse 1, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney named Tertullius. And they brought charges to the governor against Paul. So here we see a couple people that we already know. High priest Ananias, we've run into him several times. You run into him going all the way back to the gospel. Likely some of the men of the Sanhedrin, the older and respected men among the Jewish leadership. And then this third man we see mentioned is named Tertullius. Different translations may call him an attorney or an orator. And either goes with what his job is. So, and one of the things Reese mentions, Tertullius probably isn't the only guy who has this kind of job. There are these different men throughout the Roman Empire who would live in certain regions, and they were well versed in Roman law, and they were known for being great speakers. And so different people would hire them to represent them before the governors. They're essentially the lawyers of their day. Tertullius is here being paid by the Jewish leaders to present their case before Felix. Some of the reasons for this, besides him knowing the law when speaking to a Roman governor and being a good speaker, is very often if you have someone who repeatedly, and we aren't told if Tertullius is specifically in this instance, but it is generally the case with lawyers. If you have someone who commonly appears before the court, they'll know the judge is there. They know what kinds of things are more appealing to them. And the reason they might do this in this case is because, as we'll see, and we've already seen with the centurion's letter, they don't have a particularly strong case against Paul, but they're trying to pursue the legal action anyway. So it's very possible they're trying to get someone familiar to kind of move things a little bit more in their favor when their case is already kind of shaky. It's likely that Tertullius was not a Jew. Reason for this, and we'll read this in just a moment here, but I'll mention it now. He refers to the Jews as this nation in the third person. He doesn't refer to himself as being one of the Jews. And then the ending on his name is also, or the ending with US is more in line with Roman or Greek names at that time. So it's more likely that he is Roman or Greek than a Jew. And then, of course, with the kind of case that they're presenting, so in modern America, we usually have either a criminal case that's brought by the state, or you have a civil case where you have two private parties suing one another for some reason. What we see here with Paul seems like almost a mix of the two, because in civil cases, you don't very frequently see the accused party being held in prison for a short period of time before the trial. But because Tertullius and the Jewish leaders are the ones bringing the suit and not Rome, we can't quite say that it's a criminal case either. At least not in the standard sense. So he seems to be kind of in a little bit of a mix here as to what kind of case is being brought before Felix. So with that, that's kind of the background on where we are with the Jewish leadership being here. Now if we could get verses 2 through 9.
So Paul was called in, and Tertullus stated the case against him. Honorable Felix, you have brought our people a long period of peace, and because of your concern, our nation is much better off. All of us are always grateful for what you have done. I don't want to bother you, but please be patient with us and listen to me for just a few minutes. This man has been found to be a real pest and troublemaker for all our people, all over the world. He is also a leader of a group called the Nazarenes. When he tried to disgrace the temple, we arrested him. If you question him, you will find out for yourself that our charges are true. The Jewish crowd spoke up and agreed with what Tertullus had said.
All right, thank you. So, can I ask what translation that is, real quick?
CEV.
CEV? Okay.
I could have done
Yeah.
anyone.
That's fine. I was just curious because it was a little different from mine, but that's fine. So anyway, we have Tertullius presenting. He comes up. He presents this case against the Jews, or against Paul rather. We see right here starting off with a lot of very flowery language towards Felix. I'm trying to get on Felix's good side. We all know that old phrase, flattery will get you everywhere, and Tertullius appears to be a strong believer in that statement. At least in new NASB, I don't know. Do we have some other translations at the end for when it refers to the Jewish nation? I know mine says that this nation. I think Carol curious what some of the other ones say. NIV says this.
Which verse?
Verse 2. Should be at the end of verse 2.
Yeah,
This nation? Okay.
This nation.
Alright, so most of them tend to lean that way then. So he's talking about the nice things that Felix has done for them. Yeah.
I was going to say, did you find anything about verses 6, 7, and 8? Why they?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a moment. Something else about the flattery here that Tertullius says before Felix. The word there for providence, Reese notes, is commonly associated with declarations regarding Caesar. So when he talks about your provident, it says providence reforms in mind. Some might say providential reforms or something along those lines. The words there are usually associated with Caesar. So he's kind of trying to get to Felix by elevating him a little bit. Usually has an almost divine connotation. Is the way that word would be used. And then we've also seen, at least mine, it refers to it as most excellent. In verse 3, it calls him most excellent Felix. We've seen that used in relation to offices before. Actually, this section where he says that to Felix is one of the reasons we believe back in chapter 1 that Theophilus is also some kind of Roman official. Because in Luke chapter 1, he's called most excellent Theophilus. So then, in following verses, starting in, I believe it's verse 4, verse 5, we have these accusations that the Jews are bringing against Paul. First one is a pest. The word there means pestilence, plague, or epidemic. And the idea that Tertullius is trying to sell here, as we know, Paul is very effective in spreading the gospel around, but to the Jewish leaders' perspective, that's not a good thing for them. And to see it spread like wildfire, they are equating it to something like a plague or pestilence. Now, it's funny they use that word because the exact opposite is true. While it's true that the word of God spreads quick, it's not something that's bringing sickness and death to people. It's something that's bringing healing and life to people, and bringing it rather quickly. So that's the first kind of accusation we see there. Then he says that the other thing Paul's doing is he's stirring up dissension amongst all the Jews throughout the world. So world there is referring to the Roman Empire. And I do find it funny that he's referring to Paul as being the one causing dissension. Now, we could maybe say there's one sense in which this is true. Jesus talks about how he didn't come to bring peace but a sword when it came to the gospel, and how there'd be some contention coming as a result of that. So I guess there's one sense in which we could say it's true. But the other funny thing is, if you guys remember who's been following Paul around, those Jews from Asia who followed him all through his missionary journeys, and then on the last one followed him all the way back to Jerusalem, they're the ones that seem to be causing more dissension, at least I think from Luke's perspective here. They're the ones that are causing it more so than Paul. So I found that a little bit funny. I'll get to in a moment. The other thing he could be referring to is the thing that happened in Acts 22 when Paul says, "Oh, I'm on trial because I believe in the resurrection," and that heats up an already brewing argument between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Dad?
ESV uses riots instead of dissension.
Okay.
So the translators there probably are taking it as he's using a technical legal term to try to push that narrative a bit, which is interesting because there were some riots, but they, like in Ephesus, almost a riot.
Yeah. But
And there were two times pagans, so there's at least a couple times the pagans went after Paul, and even more viciously than the Jews.
okay, yeah. So if we're referring to riots more specifically, again, I think we can see a technical, and this is how it often is with lawyers. There's a technical way in which they're right, because Paul is the center of a lot of these disturbances and even riots throughout not just Jewish parts of the Roman world, but some of the pagan parts. But Paul isn't ever the cause of those, if you notice. If we go back to chapter 19, when we were in Ephesus, there was a riot that started there because of Paul's teaching. But Paul isn't the one who caused the riot. It was caused by the silversmiths, who were worried that Paul was going to take away all their business. Same thing with when we got down to Jerusalem. Paul's there doing a purification ritual. The Jews from Asia arrive, and they kind of start a riot about him being there. But he hasn't done anything. In fact, the thing that they accuse him of, and we're going to see it hinted at again, they accuse Paul of having brought a Gentile into the temple to defile it. And we see that none of that actually happened. He never brought his one companion Trophimus. He was a Gentile. He never brought him into the temple. So that's part of why they're bringing that up. Now, one charge that's probably more true is he refers to Paul as a ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes. Again, he's technically true, but not in the way that he's presenting it. The term there for ringleader is only used once in the New Testament, and it comes from their words related to military leaders or standard bearers, kind of at the front of an army, someone who's going to be leading an attack or leading the charge against the enemy. And Paul certainly is that for the early church. Now, considering obviously Jesus is the ultimate head of the church, he's ascended in heaven at this point. So for other people on earth outside the church looking in at the church, Paul and the apostles are going to appear to be the ringleaders, even though one might say they're only a secondary command, to keep with the military analogy. So that's why they're referring to Paul as a ringleader. And then I found sect of the Nazarenes interesting because it looks like one of the first times where the Jews are publicly trying to disassociate Christianity from Judaism. The reason I say this is one of the first times because we've seen a couple times where they've accused both Stephen and Paul of teaching against Moses and against the customs that were handed down to the Jews. In those cases, it was more than accusing the individuals, Stephen and Paul, of doing this. Here we start to see that they're referring to this sect of the Nazarenes as something a little bit different from the Jewish religion. So we've had a couple discussions throughout the last few weeks about how in the early church we saw Christians be able to be Jews at the same time. Those two things at the time weren't mutually exclusive. And this seems to be one of the first times where the Jews are starting to try to break that apart. And then finally we see here in verse 6, he says, "And Paul even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him." Again, this goes back to that charge of Paul bringing Trophimus into the temple, which, as we already saw, never actually happened. Trophimus never entered the temple. It was only Paul in there. And I remind you again, he was doing a Jewish purification ritual. It was a purification ritual according to the law of Moses. So it is funny that now, since the leaders, they were wrong about how Paul was trying to bring a Gentile into the temple. So now they're kind of left with well, he didn't do it, but we know he wanted to do it. He just wasn't successful in doing it. So we arrested him and brought him before you. So those are the main charges laid out. Now, as for this bracketed section, which Mom brought up a moment ago, most of it is just referring to, it's kind of just giving the little legal rigmarole of like, okay, we had these accusations, we wanted to judge him, but since you're the authority in the area, we brought him to you. And it's not really anything that we wouldn't know outside the other verses. It's just explaining the steps they're doing through the legal process here. The reason it is bracketed in most texts is because this does appear in a lot of or what Reese says is the Western manuscripts, and then also some of the Syriac, Vulgate, and Byzantine manuscripts, but it's not in all of the old manuscripts. As to whether those couple verses there are with the original Book of Acts or if they're a very early edition. Again, not a huge, I don't think it's particularly important because it's not something that we wouldn't have known without the other verses already. So it's very clearly something taught by other parts of the Bible. So I think, and then there are certainly a large group of the manuscripts do include it. So it's one of those areas you kind of treat it like it's kind of stuck in the same place as Mark 16, I believe it's verses 9 through 16, where it's in some of the manuscripts, but it's not in all of them. And in this case, whereas with Mark, it's in a lot of the manuscripts, but not the very oldest ones. In this one, it's not in all of the manuscripts from all of the regions of the Roman world where they would have been written.
So, sorry, I got distracted. What's bracketed? Because I don't have brackets.
The middle of verse 6.
Middle of verse 8.
So it starts with, we wanted to judge him according to our own law. That part of verse 6. All of verse 7. And then the first part of verse 8, ordering his accusers to come before you. So by the time Tertullius gets back to by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, well, not, that's already back to what's in all the manuscripts. It's like a verse in 2 half verses.
It is pretty small.
Yeah.
What did Jordan to judge versus R?
Well, they start out with a lie. They said, we wanted to judge
Okay.
him according to our own law. No, they were ripping at him, dragging him out of the temple. He would have been dead.
Yeah.
Lysias wouldn't have intervened.
This,
And then I wonder if Lysias is there, because it looks like another lie. They said, but Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands. They were the ones
Yeah.
who were causing the violence.
Yeah. Well, Lysias, we'll see later on, he's not here yet. Because Felix at the end to kind of delay things, he's like, I'm going to delay making my final judgment until Lysias arrives because I want to question him. Is like a paraphrase of what he says. So Lysias is not there yet, but he is coming. The other funny thing about them mentioning we wanted to judge him according to our own law. If he had brought Trophimus into the temple, the Romans would have allowed them to judge Paul and Trophimus according to their law. That was one of the things. That was like the one time the Jews were allowed to enact the death penalty without the Romans' approval was if a Gentile was brought into the temple. The Romans let them enforce that themselves. So it is funny him saying that we wanted to judge him according to our own law. The thing is, the one thing they wanted to judge him by, Paul never did. So you're going back a little bit to kind of the snottiness here of Tertullius.
There was no record of a trial, because
Yeah.
the Sanhedrin would have had to do that and all that.
I mean, I say we cut the guy a little bit of credit. He's a lawyer. He's doing pretty good as far as lawyers go. So,
They could slither through a bucket of fish hooks and not get a scratch.
yeah. So, and then in verse 9, or at the end of verse 8, Tertullius finishes his short bit, and then the Jews, almost kind of like witnesses, they say they join in the attack, asserting that these things were so. They're offering their testimony as like, yes, what Tertullius says is accurate.
so were you working out at NASB?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the ESV it's not even bracketed, they just removed it.
But they
Okay,
So
you
it goes
guys,
from 6 to 8.
well,
yours
it's
go-
six,
yours goes
then
from
it
6 to 8.
7.
That makes me wonder.
So I was just checking the translator notes for Net Bible, and that it's saying that it's actually very few witnesses that have the other version. So it's
Very few
really
manuscripts have those
very
verses.
few had it.
Yeah. Kind of like, it reminded me, there is another time where you had that.
Says lacking from the better witnesses. There's no easy explanation for how such could be missing from the
It also reminded me of there's one other time where it happens is Acts 8:37. I bet if you went back and looked, there's probably a chance ESV wouldn't have that one either.
I'll say
'Cause-
one other thing, just in my own thinking, to have the lawyer paint such a wonderful picture of Felix, but then to make an accusation against other Roman authorities, that seems pretty harsh.
Might have been out of place.
That with great violence. But then it's a weird thing to get stuck into the text. So
Yeah.
I want to take a look.
Yeah. So that is the end of the accusers speaking. Now, the next 11 verses, which I'll go ahead and read, is Paul's defense before Felix. It says, when the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship, neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself, did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience before both God and before men. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified, without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia, who ought to have been present before you to make an accusation, if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeeds they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. So here we see Paul's defense. Verse 22 is going to, at the end of verse 21, puts the quotation marks on it. Verse 22 is going to talk about Felix's response. So Paul also, in a way similar to Tertullius, he opens with a statement that is honoring of Felix. However, I think we can comfortably say it lacks a lot of the flattery and it's almost like a hyperbole that Tertullius uses. Paul doesn't go that far. But right off the bat, when he's talking about many years you've been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense because of that, because you can take note of the fact that in the last 12 days, I haven't been the cause of anything. Paul appeals to Felix's long-standing status as their governor, and in this case, their judge. He appeals to that as almost a proof in his favor. He's like, you know that there haven't been cases brought up before you where I'm the cause of some riot, and there wasn't one just recently in the same way. Or rather that he wasn't the cause of one. Now, Paul continues to state that the accusations against him are groundless. If you remember, it talks about how Tertullius says in verse 8, and this is the latter half, not the portion, not the bracketed portion. Tertullius says that if Felix were to just examine Paul himself, he would see that all these things they say are true. We already see out of the gate with Paul's response that that's not going to be the case. Paul resoundingly denies that he's the cause of these problems and riots that the Jews accuse him of. And then Paul continues to reaffirm his dedication to the Christian faith as the proper way to serve God in the now Christian age. So he refers to how he serves the God. He says the God of our fathers. So he's referring to, obviously referring to God, but he's making a proclamation that the Christian faith is now the way in which we're supposed to serve God. And then he says that he believes and follows all the things in the law and the prophets. And I find this is something that's somewhat important for us. And the reason it's important is because there are a lot of Christians who erroneously believe that the Old Testament doesn't matter to us anymore because we now have the New Testament. It is an unfortunately, I don't know if it's necessarily a majority belief, how many people believe it or not, but it is certainly, there are certainly a lot of people who believe it. And it's not the case at all, because while the apostles are both writing and living the New Testament before it's being written down, we see them constantly refer back to the Old Testament law and the prophets. And whether they include Psalms as the law of the prophets, there's also a lot of other writings in the Old Testament they refer to. I'm trying to think. I think it's like Ezekiel, or no, not Ezekiel. Maybe only one other book in the Old Testament never gets referred to in the New Testament. The vast majority of them are referred to, and then you'll have some parts like a few of the chapters of Psalms are just mentioned over and over and over again, both by the apostles and by Jesus. Both quote the Old Testament on a regular basis, and because we see them use the Old Testament so much, I believe it's very clearly inferred that the Old Testament isn't something we throw away. It's not something of mild importance for us. It's something of pretty great importance because Jesus and the apostles treat it that way. All of the Bible that we have is Scripture inspired by God. That makes all of it important. Now, that doesn't mean that we are going to apply everything from each book in any given situation. And just what I mean by that is sometimes if we're struggling with something like theft at the moment, we're not going to be too worried about the sacrificial system at that particular point in time. But there's other times where when we're studying the Old Testament, even though we don't follow the sacrificial system anymore, a lot of those old rituals are very important for understanding the foreshadowing as to what Jesus was going to do for us. So there's different ways different places, different ways where the Old Testament becomes pretty important for us. And very often, there's several times where the New Testament, one of the apostles or Jesus will declare something about what an Old Testament passage is referring to, and they'll kind of commentate on it that way. And then there's sometimes when they reference a small portion of an Old Testament passage, that illuminates, or the rest of the Old Testament passage provides a better understanding of what they're talking about in the New Testament. Some of the ways that the Bible helps to interpret itself. So whenever you're doing Bible study or Bible reading, obviously we tend to, there is a tendency to focus on the New Testament that I don't think is completely misplaced, because things like the plan of salvation and what Jesus did on the cross, those are things you're only going to find clearly laid out in the New Testament. You can find some prophecies about it in the Old Testament, but you don't see the entire gospel laid out in the Old Testament. You don't see the plan of salvation laid out in the Old Testament. There's some things we only find in the New Testament. But we shouldn't neglect the Old Testament completely in our study of the Word, because all of it is important. And it very often helps us understand the New Testament better. Then verse 15, even back to this, Paul it's funny, he kind of rubs in the resurrection again. And it's funny because if I remember correctly, High Priest Ananias, and certainly a lot of the Sanhedrin elders, were Sadducees. So they didn't believe in the resurrection. So I could almost imagine Paul saying this in court, or he's standing there before Felix, he starts talking about the resurrection, then he just looks over at the Jewish leaders while he's saying it. I could imagine that. Obviously, if there's Pharisee elders among them, they would be in agreement with Paul on the resurrection. Then Paul continues to reaffirm his piety towards God. He talks about how the time when he was arrested, and when they laid hands on him, he wasn't causing any riot. It was one of the first times in years that he had brought an offering back to the temple. He was going through the purification rituals, and then we start to see him mention here the Jews from Asia. It's also interesting, he mentions that they should be there to bring an accusation against him, because over these past, may even be over a period of years now, that these Jews have been following him and stirring up trouble in a lot of the places where Paul went to. I think it's certainly a good time for Paul to be mentioning, like, these guys have been following me around, accusing me of stuff for years. This would absolutely be the time for them to bring charges against me if they have some.
Why do you think they weren't there?
Because they probably didn't actually have anything to accuse him of substance.
Well, I think
would be
they
my
would've,
guess.
I think they would have condemned themselves.
Mm.
Because the fact is, since they were following him and stirring up trouble everywhere he went, it really, they would be seriously breaking Roman law by what they had. I refuse to testify on the grounds that they tend to.
Yeah, I'd imagine if they were there and they had an equivalent of the Fifth Amendment, there'd probably be a lot of that amongst the Asian Jews. Then let's see here, where were we? And then here, verse 20 and 21, one of the last things that Paul says here. He's talking about. They're talking about this misdeed they found when he stood before the council. He's basically saying they couldn't find any except for maybe this one statement regarding the resurrection from the dead. Now, there's two opinions on this. Most scholars tend to view this as Paul admitting the one time he made a statement that caused something of an uproar was when he said that bit about the resurrection to tactfully get the Pharisees and Sadducees to turn on each other. That caused enough confusion that the Roman centurion pulled him out into safety, and it kind of ended his interrogation before the council. Reese thinks that Paul shouldn't be admitting any time when he's possibly the cause of a riot, and so his opinion is more that this is Paul admitting the one difference, or one area of difference between him and his accusers. I tend to lean, at least as of right now, my opinion lies more with the other scholars, simply because, one, it does seem like Paul's talking about this is maybe the one thing they could perceive as a misdeed of mine. The other thing is, I think there's more areas of difference between Paul and the Jewish leaders than just the resurrection of the dead. And amongst the entire Pharisee wing of the Jewish leaders, it wouldn't be a difference between them at all, but there'd be different things they disagreed on.
I think Paul and the leaders don't want to get into those theological differences before Felix, because it would be meaningless to them. Or
It doesn't necessarily concern Felix. And I'm trying to remember which. I don't remember if it's Pontius Pilate or Herod or who else, but I think there's another time where there's a similar trial. Or no, it's back in like chapter 13 or 14 when I think they bring him before Sergius Justus, and he's like, you guys handle this. This is clearly a matter over the particulars of your own law and religion. So you guys deal with it. You don't need to be bringing Paul before me. So we do see some other times where they do get close to that. And then I don't know if they told them about if the Jews from Asia told the leaders about the last time it happened, but the last time Paul was completely let off when they let it get into just a dispute over their religion. Because the Romans, they aren't concerned about the finer points of Jewish religion. They're just there to keep the peace. So bringing Paul before Felix for rioting is one thing that they would pay attention to and maybe act on. Differences over the Jewish religion isn't something he's going to be concerned about. That doesn't mean that Felix is entirely disinterested with the religion. And this is where we get to, Nana, you have verses 22 to 27. So we see Felix engaged in some delay tactics here. Thank you for reading, by the way. We see Felix here engaged in some delay tactics, and ultimately he ends up delaying for a couple of years and just leaving Paul to sit there in prison. And he calls Paul in from time to time, and at first it does seem like he has at least some interest in the way. It says that he has some fairly accurate knowledge about the way. Paul comes to talk self-control. Then they get to that part about the judgment, and it kind of spooks Felix, and it kind of reminds me of how a lot of people are today, where you start to mention that J word, judgment, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to hear about that. I'll call you back when I'm comfortable." And so, kind of a sad indictment of Felix that, in one sense, there was a part of him that was interested and wanted to hear, but he let it be overrun both by his excessive desire for comfort, and we also see that he's kind of greedy here. He wants Paul to give him some money to make it worth his while to let him go against these, ostensibly, the Jewish leadership were quite powerful and quite rich within their region. So they would have a lot of resources that might benefit Felix in the future. And there's one other thing here. Oh yeah, this passage does also bring about a fulfillment of one of Jesus' prophecies. This is something he says to Ananias. Papep, if you could quickly read Acts 9:15-16.
But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake.
Thanks. And so we see here one of the first times, well, I guess not one of the first times, but one of many times in which Jesus' prophecy about Paul is going to be coming true. It comes true many, many times, and according to tradition, Paul's ultimately going to get to speak before Nero and share the gospel with him. But I get Paul is, over these last couple chapters, not only has he been speaking to the leaders, but he's also getting some of that taste of how much he does have to suffer for Jesus' name, in part of because what he used to do to the church. So we see that. Then another good lesson for us here is to beware of greed, because that's really the major thing that blinds Felix to the gospel here. Because he does keep bringing Paul back to under the pretense of listening to him, but he really wants money. Now, the way things are right now, I'm amazed that we don't have a problem with bribery in courts across the United States. It happens from time to time, but it's not a widespread problem at this point. Around the world, there are a lot of countries where it's almost commonplace that both sides will pay the judge ahead of time. One country that I'm pretty sure about is Russia. It's actually very commonplace for both sides to pay the judge ahead of time in order to ensure that there's actually a fair trial. So, kind of a rough situation. We see Felix here blinded by greed when something that would really... He's also got this problem where he's uncomfortable with this talk about the judgment to come and all the things with the Christian life, when Paul's offering the one thing that would provide him comfort. And so it's sad to see how Felix is getting in his own way of solving his own problem. So something that we have to be on guard against ourselves is this love of money. It can certainly be a dangerous thing. Paul talks to Timothy about the love of money being a root of all kinds of evil.
He also seems to want to put it off for more convenient. In other words, let me have my fun now, and then I'll wait till later, and then I'll think about this.
Yeah.
It might spoil something.
Yeah, the kind of person who
I have to change my
kind of person who takes the chance on waiting to start thinking about it until 75 or 80 or 85. and then they never really start to think about it. Yeah, so we see kind of similar thing here with Felix. And then right there at the very end, we see Felix, to try to keep some peace between, or not necessarily keep peace, just to do the Jews a favor, decides to leave Paul in prison after these 2 years. And it is kind of, it's irksome to see him say, when Lysias gets here, I'll make my decision, and then drags on for 2 years and never makes his decision. One has to wonder if either Lysias is just the slowest moving traveler on the planet, or if Felix never really intended to make a quick decision on this.
Or Paul, he was, it sounds like he was disturbed about the nature of Christianity and that there was a judgment involved. 'Cause
Yeah.
right when he hears about sin and judgment, he reacts against it.
Yeah.
So he was interested in it. His wife's Jewish, so that creates some different things, but I don't think he wanted to change the way he lived. He wanted a bride. He was a worldly man.
Yeah. So it's sad to see someone with a bit of potential there kind of throw it away.
Does Reese say, I was assuming that if you were done with your term and you haven't decided something, was technically Paul supposed to go free, but you left him in there as the fate, because it's pointed out here.
Yeah, I don't remember any specifics on that.
Seems like the fact that they brought it up was unusual. There's
I-
Paul, could have been free because.
I think they were allowed to do either. He just
Right.
ended the football ball.
Yeah. I mean,
Porcius is a weird name.
yeah, Porcius. Ours said Porcius. NIV said Pontius.
Portius.
Oh, it is Porcius. Okay. So
It means swine bite.
well, I'm sure his mother loved him.
But is it a nickname? That's what I was wondering, and I can't find
Whether he was a Jew.
Now I'm interested to wonder what Festus means.
that. Porcine.
Does anyone know what Festus means?
He's a really good deputy.
Yeah. Well.
Just,
Oh yeah.
the Asian Jews, because of this 2-year law, they didn't get exactly what they wanted. But Paul's in prison, he's not out there preaching, and this is kind of, they wanted to shut him down. And as long as he's over in Caesarea, way over there, he's not in Jerusalem. He's not going to be in Asia anymore.
Yeah,
So
they
they
think it's a
kind
big.
of got what they wanted, so maybe
Yeah.
this whole thing died down. And I'm surprised, it sounded, verse 22, it sounds like this is going to continue. That Lysias is going to come, and they're going to get maybe the Asian Jews
Yeah.
and have this big trial. But, just leave it out. Because maybe they just want peace. The Romans just want peace.
Yeah.
If there's peace, they don't have to answer the Roman court.
Yeah. Well, that's a good observation, because could very easily, could very easily see them viewing this as something of victory. Because for the next 4 chapters, it just focuses on Paul while he's imprisoned on his way to Rome. He's not out in the open preaching. Now, the only thing
People are allowed
the only
to
thing
visit him.
add to that, well, yeah, one, people can visit him,
So he's just
and
training
he has
preachers.
visitors.
That's
Yeah,
what-
he has guys like Luke
Yeah.
that are following him around. But the other thing I was thinking of is once he gets to Rome, I can't remember which epistle it is that hints at this, but he gets to Rome initially, and then it appears like there is a period of time where he's set free initially, and entertains the idea of going to visit Spain and preach over there. So we know from other letters that Paul's work is just on the open mission field. Besides training preachers who then go out, none of it's done.
We know from 1 Timothy, essentially he got released.
Yeah.
It's really hard to read any other way around it.
Okay, so it's 1 Timothy that says
So
that.
1 Timothy gives you the idea that he's out and about traveling again and doing stuff. 2 Timothy, he's back in jail.
For a second time.
last time, yeah, he knows he's gonna die.
Yeah. All right. Well, good discussion. We probably ran a bit long, but it seemed like people were enjoying it. So, all right. Well, let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day that you've blessed us with, where we can come and open your word and learn from Paul's example. Help us to not be blinded by greed when we have to think through important spiritual things, to not be distracted by the things of this world, but to stay focused on you. We're thankful for this day and your many blessings. And it's your Son's name we pray and give you thanks. Amen.